A police officer takes the stand, confident and ready to lie. He believes his badge will protect him. The woman he accused sits quietly, watching. He has no idea who she really is. With a calm smile, she stands and hands the judge a folder. In that moment, everything changes. The officer's confidence fades. His lies start to crumble. Who is this woman? Why does the judge's expression shift? And why is the officer suddenly sweating? One thing is certain, he thought he was in control, but he just made the biggest mistake of his life. Forever, before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today, and if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a new one. The courtroom was packed, tension thick in the air. Officer Chad Reynolds sat confidently at the witness stand, a smug smirk on his face as he glanced toward the defendant's table. Across from him sat a composed, elegant black woman in a navy blue suit, Danielle Carter. She didn't flinch, didn't even break a sweat. But Chad assumed that was just her putting on a brave face. After all, she was the one on trial. And after today, she'd be behind bars, just like he planned. Chad had spent weeks building a case against her, fabricated evidence, fake witness statements, and a few convenient security footage edits. It was perfect. Nobody would believe a word she said. He'd seen it happen before. Clearing his throat, the prosecutor stood. Officer Reynolds, can you describe the incident in detail? Chad nodded, putting on his best concerned citizen act. Of course, he began. I caught Ms. Carter tampering with evidence from an active case. When I confronted her, she tried to bribe me, offering me 10 grand to keep quiet. A murmur ran through the courtroom. The judge banged his gavel. Danielle sat perfectly still, her hands folded neatly on the table. She didn't object, she didn't argue, she simply waited. Chad smirked again. She was done. Then, slowly, Danielle stood up. She adjusted the cuffs of her blazer, walked toward the judge's bench, and handed over a folder. Your Honor, she said coolly, before I let this officer dig his own grave any further, I'd like to enter some evidence into the record. Chad frowned. What evidence? He'd destroyed everything. The judge opened the folder, eyes scanning the contents. Then his expression changed, shifting from curiosity to something dangerously close to amusement. Ms. Carter, the judge said, lifting a brow, do you mind sharing with the court your full credentials? Danielle turned to Chad and smiled for the first time. Gladly, she said. Then she dropped the bombshell. I'm Special Agent Danielle Carter, Assistant Director of the FBI's Internal Affairs Division. Chad felt his stomach drop. The courtroom fell silent. You could hear a pin drop. Chad's smug expression shattered instantly, his face draining of color. Excuse me? The prosecutor stammered, clearly blindsided. Danielle turned to the jury, her voice steady and firm. I have spent years investigating corruption within law enforcement. And imagine my surprise when I found Officer Reynolds at the center of multiple complaints, fabricated charges, excessive force, tampered evidence. She gestured toward the folder the judge was still holding. In those documents, Your Honor, you'll find proof that Officer Reynolds has a history of framing innocent people, especially black citizens. My case is just the latest in a long list of victims. Chad jolted upright in his seat. That's a lie, he snapped, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. Danielle turned to him, completely unfazed. Is it? She asked, her eyebrow raised. Because unlike you, Officer Reynolds, I have real evidence, and I took the liberty of making sure multiple federal agencies have copies. The judge leaned forward, skimming through the documents, his frown deepening. Officer Reynolds, he said sharply, how do you explain this surveillance footage showing you planting evidence in Ms. Carter's vehicle? Chad's mouth opened, but no words came out. He had deleted that footage himself. How did she... Danielle stepped closer, lowering her voice so only he could hear. "You really thought you could outplay an FBI agent," she whispered. "Bad move." Chad's heart pounded, sweat trickled down his back. The walls were closing in. And then, Chad's breathing grew shallow. His mind raced, searching for a way out, but every exit was blocked. The prosecutor, who had been confidently leading the case just minutes ago, now looked like he wanted to disappear. The judge tapped the folder on his desk, his tone turning ice cold. "Officer Reynolds, you are under oath. I strongly suggest you explain yourself before I hold you in contempt." Chad gulped, gripping the edge of the witness stand. His usual arrogance was gone. "Your Honor, this is clearly a setup. She's lying. She probably edited that footage." Danielle didn't even blink. "You really want to go down that road?" she asked, tilting her head. Then she turned to the judge. "I expected this reaction, so I had the footage analyzed by an independent forensic team. Their report is also in that folder. The timestamps, metadata, and chain of custody are intact." The judge flipped through the pages, nodding. "It's authentic," he confirmed, his voice sharp. Then he turned back to Chad. "And Officer Reynolds, how do you explain the bank statements that show unexplained cash deposits right after you arrested several innocent civilians?" Chad's jaw clenched. He had nothing. The murmurs in the courtroom were growing louder. Jurors exchanged glances. The court officers were shifting uncomfortably. Danielle took a step closer. "You were so confident, weren't you?" she said, her voice still calm but carrying an unmistakable weight. "Framing me was supposed to be easy. You didn't know who I was, and you thought no one would question you." She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice just enough for Chad to hear. "But you messed with the wrong woman." Chad's pulse thundered in his ears. He could feel the walls closing in. And then, "Bailiff," the judge ordered, his voice steady, "take Officer Reynolds into custody, effective immediately." The entire courtroom gasped. Chad's eyes widened in pure shock. "Wait, what?" he stammered, gripping the witness stand like it was his last lifeline. The bailiff, a tall, stocky officer, stepped forward. "Hands behind your back, Reynolds," he ordered firmly. Chad shot up from his seat, his face red with rage. "You can't do this. I'm the one who makes the arrests. I'm a cop." Danielle folded her arms, watching with an amused smirk. "Not anymore." The judge didn't even flinch at Chad's outburst. "Officer Reynolds, you are being taken into custody on suspicion of perjury, obstruction of justice, and evidence tampering. You will await formal charges pending an internal investigation." Chad's hands trembled as the cold steel of the handcuffs locked around his wrists. "This is a mistake! She set me up!" he yelled, his voice cracking as the bailiff yanked him backward. Danielle let out a small chuckle. "That's funny," she said, tilting her head, "because that's exactly what you tried to do to me." The jurors watched in stunned silence. The prosecutor, now completely pale, shuffled his papers with shaky hands. He had backed the wrong man, and he knew it. As Chad was dragged toward the exit, he threw one last desperate look at the judge. "You're ruining my life," he yelled. The judge simply sighed. "No, Officer Reynolds, you did that yourself." The heavy doors swung open, and just like that, the once confident officer was gone, taken away like the very criminals he had spent years framing. Danielle turned to the judge. "Your Honor, given the circumstances, I assume the case against me is dismissed?" The judge nodded firmly. "Case dismissed." He banged his gavel. Danielle exhaled slowly, but she wasn't surprised. She had planned for everything. As she gathered her things, the prosecutor rushed over. His previous arrogance was gone. Now he just looked terrified. "Miss Carter, I had no idea." She held up a hand. "Save it," she said coolly. "You helped a dirty cop try to ruin my life. You'll be hearing from the FBI soon." His face turned ghostly white. With that, Danielle walked out of the courtroom, her heels clicking confidently against the marble floor. Justice had been served, but she wasn't done yet. There were more corrupt officers like Chad out there, and she was going to take them all down, one by one. Since the main conflict in the courtroom has been resolved, we can continue by exploring what happens next in Danielle Carter's mission to expose corruption. Here's the next part. As Danielle stepped out of the courthouse, the crisp afternoon air filled her lungs. The sunlight hit her face, but she didn't bask in the moment. There was still work to be done. Her phone buzzed. She pulled it out and saw a message from an unknown number. "You made a big mistake. You don't know who you're messing with. Walk away before it's too late." Danielle's lips curled into a smirk. Threats like this didn't scare her. If anything, they told her she was getting closer to something big. She tapped her screen, forwarding the message to her team at the FBI with a simple note. "Trace this." Just then, a familiar voice called her name. "Agent Carter?" She turned to see Marcus Hill, a trusted colleague from the bureau, jogging up to her. "That was some show you put on in there," he said with a grin. Danielle chuckled. "You know me, Marcus. I don't like loose ends." His smile faded slightly. "Well, speaking of loose ends, you might want to see this." He handed her a manila folder. Danielle opened it and quickly scanned the pages inside. What she saw made her blood run cold. Officer Chad Reynolds wasn't working alone. There were names, connections, other officers, high-ranking officials. This wasn't just one bad cop. This was a whole system of corruption, and it ran deeper than she thought. Danielle clenched her jaw. This wasn't over, not even close. Danielle's eyes darted across the names in the file, each one more shocking than the last. Some of these officers weren't just rookies or beat cops. They were high-ranking officials, captains, and even a few district attorneys. She let out a slow breath. "So that's why Reynolds was so confident," she muttered. "He had protection." Marcus nodded grimly. "This goes all the way up, Danielle. We're talking about a network of officers covering for each other, framing innocent people, planting evidence, taking bribes. Reynolds was just a pawn." Danielle's grip on the folder tightened. "And if this file is right, there's one name that stands out more than the rest." She turned the page and landed on Deputy Commissioner William Hayes. Hayes was one of the most powerful men in the city's police force. He had built his career on a reputation of being tough on crime, but according to this evidence, he was the mastermind behind the corruption. Danielle's pulse quickened. If she was going to take down someone as powerful as Hayes, she needed a plan. Marcus seemed to read her mind. "This won't be easy," he warned. "Hayes has people everywhere. The moment he gets wind of this, he'll do whatever it takes to silence you." Danielle smirked. "Then let's make sure we strike first." She pulled out her phone and made a call. "Director Vaughn, it's Carter." "I need a federal task force assembled. Quietly. We have a bigger case on our hands." There was a pause on the other end. Then the FBI director's voice came through, steady and firm. "Understood. Send me the details." Danielle ended the call and looked at Marcus. "It's time to shake the system." Marcus nodded. "Where do we start?" Danielle glanced back at the courthouse, where Chad Reynolds had been dragged away only moments ago. "We start with him," she said. "Let's see how loyal he really is when he realizes his so-called friends are about to abandon him." She turned on her heel, determination burning in her eyes. This wasn't just about one cop anymore. This was war. Danielle and Marcus wasted no time. Within hours, the FBI task force was assembled, working in secrecy to gather more evidence. Meanwhile, Chad Reynolds sat in an interrogation room, sweating under the harsh light. At first, He refused to talk. But when Danielle laid out the truth, that his so-called allies were cutting ties, leaving him to take the fall, his tough guy act crumbled. "I didn't have a choice," he muttered, his voice shaky. "Hayes. He controls everything. If I didn't do what he wanted, I'd be the one getting framed." Danielle leaned in. "Well, now you do have a choice. Cooperate, and maybe you walk away with a deal. Stay silent, and you take the full hit." Chad swallowed hard. He knew she wasn't bluffing. After a long pause, he finally nodded. "I'll talk." With Chad's confession, the FBI moved swiftly. Within days, multiple officers were arrested, corruption charges were filed, and Deputy Commissioner William Hayes was taken into custody in a dramatic early morning raid. The city erupted in shock. News outlets covered the scandal non-stop. The people who had suffered at the hands of these corrupt cops finally saw justice. As Danielle watched the headlines, Marcus stood beside her. "You did it," he said. She shook her head. "We did it, and we're just getting started." Because as long as there were people abusing their power, she would be there, ready to take them down.